Hello everyone, this is Dan. With Vault of the Incarnates finished and Razakath taken care of, I thought I would take some time to go through each boss in the raid and just give a quick overview of what I thought about them. Each boss was going to get a rating from 1 to 10 based on how fun or challenging I found them during progress. So let's get started. Aeronaut. The first boss of any raid isn't normally anything too special, and Aeronaut was honestly no different. Quite a simple tank and spank with a few adds to deal with, and a less than threatening intermission provided everyone is on the same page. First bosses don't have to be this bland, as Abyssal Commander Shavara showed us in Eternal Palace, but by and large it is normally better to provide a smooth entry into a new tier, especially at the beginning of an expansion. I'll give Aeronaut a 4 out of 10. Taros. With lower item level, Taros was a bit of a menace. He had a somewhat tense DPS check for this early in the raid, and was a really good early indicator of how healing intense this entire tier was going to be. Mechanically, Taros was still on the simpler side with only one additional mechanic than on Heroic, which was only really impactful to a small team of range players. Still, a decently entertaining boss to progress on, and it was nice to have some form of DPS check this early in the raid, even if it's dwarfed by gear in recent weeks. Taros gets a 6 out of 10. Primal Council. Chaos. I feel like that's the ideal word for this boss for most guilds. A mess of mechanics that only serve to annoy, particularly in the case of the conductive mark as a melee player. The only true saving grace about this fight is that it was easy. However, it has been quite some time since we've had a council-style boss that has simply required grouping up the bosses and nuking as hard as possible. Normally it's required to target specific bosses like Council of Blood from Castle Nathria, or there's a staggered entry into the fight from bosses like the 9 from Sanctum of Domination. An annoying yet fast-paced and simple AoE stomp, Primal Council gets a 4 out of 10. Sanath. And here comes the spider. Sanath was another very straightforward encounter with no real hard-to-execute mechanics to work around. The ice patches on the floor combined with the drag, while easy to deal with for everyone, allowed some form of min-max play depending on your class and the level of mobility you had available to you, such as Heroic Leap or Demonic Circle. Phase 2 of the fight was quite tense with ramping raid-wide damage, constantly ice skating across the floor, and dealing with most of the same mechanics all in one go. The mythic mechanic of tornadoes on the stairs look intimidating, but they do have a predictable path, so they weren't that tough to manage. The pacing of the fight overall was pretty good, but still maybe slightly too easy for hitting the halfway mark of the raid. I'll give Sanath a 5 out of 10. Daphia Ascended. Daphia is quite possibly the first real step up in difficulty in the raid. For the first time this tier, there's a meaningful mechanic that requires some proper coordination and execution in order to complete the fight. Conductive marks need to be managed properly to spawn volatile infusers at the right time, that then need to be killed at the right time in order to go to the correct platform and kill the adds that Daphia has just spawned. All of this is to stop the boss from gaining too many stacks of a damage increase, which did prove to be deadly to us, with around 3 to 4 stacks at our progress item level. And just to make things even more interesting, there's power sliding tornadoes, Tokyo drifting all around the main platform while listening to Eurobeat, designed to ruin everyone's day. A stark contrast with every boss up to this one so far, which have generally relied on personal responsibility rather than raid-wide coordination. Perhaps I'm judging it too harshly for that reason, but even in our re-clears, Daphia is generally skipped for a very good reason. Daphia can have a rating of 3 out of 10. Kurog Grim Totem. Our mid-raid wall boss is here. To me, Kurog represents a little bit of missed opportunity. Either due to slight undertuning or incorrect tuning, particularly of the lightning zone, this boss could have been a lot cooler if you had to spend more equal amounts of time in each zone throughout the encounter. However, this doesn't stop Kurog from still being an interesting boss. A mess of mechanics when you look through the dungeon journal, but neatly broken down into each primal section in the boss room, and each mechanic on its own isn't particularly challenging to deal with. The add mechanic overlaps can cause some shaky moments, but they are few and far between, opting for more of a numbers check in both damage and healing, as most mid-raid wall-type bosses tend to be. Grief Torch was a saviour on a couple of fights for us, but Kurog might have been its standout moment. The first intermission felt significantly more boring than the second, but this is most likely due to us dragging out the first intermission as long as possible in order to get cooldowns and Grief Torches back for a big burn at the start of Phase 2. Additionally, we did end up sacrificing Shamans and utilising Ankh in the final phase just for even more Grief Torch damage in order to meet the DPS check. Quite possibly the best fight in this tier, Kurog gets a 9 out of 10. Broodkeeper Diurna. If you ever wondered what a modern day Razakath the Untamed fight from Blackwing Lair would look like, here it is. The Phase 1 ad team and boss team dynamic is fairly fun due to the rather precise movement required to deal with all of the eggs as quickly as possible, while still being able to burn through each wave of ads away from the boss. While being part of the ad team can feel like you're doing Mythic Plus for half the fight, it does allow for some interesting talent choices, as you need to have enough AoE damage to kill the ads, while still not sandbagging your boss damage too much as a result. The egg team on the boss is probably the most interesting part of the fight, even if it is limited to 3 players at most. Phase 2 is intense, particularly in terms of healing, but is fairly easily dealt with after seeing it a few times. A stacking damage increase on the boss serves as a soft DPS check which can lead to some intense moments towards the end of the fight on progress, but nothing especially difficult. This fight would have been significantly harder if the tank mechanic in Phase 2 actually required raid soaking in order to share the damage, but unfortunately this wasn't the case. Arguably having the tank being able to solo the mechanic is better than the Guardian of the first one's alternative, where multiple immunities were required to manage it, so that's one big positive at least. Broodkeeper for me gets a 7 out of 10, not a highly memorable penultimate boss. Razakath the Storm Eater. The big bad of the tier has finally arrived. Razakath has an array of fairly unique mechanics starting with the Hurricane Wing in Phase 1. This monumental pushback was interesting to different classes depending on how you needed to handle it, from warriors relying on charge and heroic leap, to priests and paladins having to rely almost solely on evokers' rescues and gateways, to death knights not realizing there was a pushback in the fight at all. The difficulty of the mechanic varied greatly depending on your class. Volatile Current was another unique mechanic that I can't recall seeing implemented before. These sparks allowed for fight-specific talent selection, including taking talents that wouldn't otherwise be taken in a standard raid scenario, such as a warrior's AoE fear. The first intermission was fairly low impact, provided your raid had a good split of DPS on each side and handled interrupts and AoE CC correctly. Once the formula was down, it was relatively smooth sailing each time. Phase 2 introduced another Star Augur / Anduin style mark mechanic in the form of Star Surge. These periodic DPS race moments to break the shield were frankly a welcome reprieve from the chaos of mechanic chaining throughout the rest of P2, even if the healers wouldn't quite agree. From Phase 2 onwards, the remainder of the fight was fast-paced, intense, and highly enjoyable. The mechanics were on a very strict rotation, allowing for good steady progression provided you hit P2 consistently. Phase 3 was a very fun, fast-paced burn of the boss. The combination of chaining mechanics, Halondra-style moat soaking, and a somewhat tight DPS check gave us a very fun final phase. As far as negatives go, frankly the Razakath fight was just too long at almost 15 minutes. While I understand that the fight is supposed to feel epic in scale and scope, an exceedingly long fight timer isn't necessary to achieve this. This fight almost didn't require the first phase or the first intermission, and cutting those 2 phases alone would have brought the fight almost within 10 minutes and still left the more entertaining sections of the fight intact, resulting in a fight with a similar feel to that of Rygalon in Sepulchre of the first ones. Fast-paced, intense, without overstaying its welcome. A final negative is the pushback mechanic, particularly in P1. At the time of recording, we have had one nerf to this mechanic, and still some classes are pretty much unable to handle it, which gatekeeps them from progressing the fight at all. Ideally, this should be addressed very soon. Overall, as far as final bosses go, Razakath is far from the worst we've ever had. Considering that this was another boss that went entirely untested during the beta cycle, I think a good job was done overall, and Razakath gets an 8 out of 10 from me. I can sum up Vault of the Incarnates with pretty much one word: average. Nothing particularly stood out this tier as exciting, and no boss was so horrendous that I'll be waking up in a cold sweat thinking about it 3 years down the line. But this was almost expected from the first tier of the new era of WoW as it's being referred to. A lot of the fun in this raid for me is tied to the design of my class and the new talent trees, and I think that this was somewhat expected from Blizzard's side. Next tier I am hoping for something a little bit more special, however. So there you have it. Those are my thoughts on each boss from Vault of the Incarnates. Let me know what bosses you particularly liked or disliked in the comments down below. Or, if you want to tell me directly, you can follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/Dan_war, or follow me on Twitter at method_downwar. Dragonflight is shaping up to be a great expansion, and you won't want to miss any content that we have to bring you in the future, so make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss out. Finally, do leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it, or even if you just enjoyed listening to me speak words for a little while. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you again very soon.